Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and so far in this series we've talked a lot about recent world history and how it all teaches us important lessons to carry forward into our understanding of Ukraine and Russia right now. So now that we have time to talk more about global context before getting into a discussion of how the war is going on the ground, that means it's time to really address the elephant in the room: NATO in the post-Cold War era. On one hand, there was absolutely a chance since the end of the Cold War, and an opportunity as well to say, everybody listen, countries are massively impoverished and starving right now, and we're going to step in and be the bigger people here. And we could have stepped in and done everything that we could do to economically help the former Soviet states recover and build them into functioning states. We never did that, though. We never offered them aid until they were being invaded. We just let oligarchs take control of all of that power, to re-solidify it under fundamentally corrupt structures and monopolies. We thought that this would be better because it was capitalist now. And the damage that that allowed them to do. And not only that, but the ability to get away with it. That damage had in part been done by our inaction. We never allowed them, even the civilians, to shift in our minds from enemies to innocents, or even the victims of a part that we had played in a larger war. And this was doubly true of Russia and Russian citizens. It's like our empire needs a heel, a growing threat. And Russia was our easy enemy. It's not even hard to make us wary of Russia. Look at how many of us ate up Russiagate and really believed that Russia had interfered with our election in some meaningful way, other than driving divisive propaganda online on social media. I'm not saying that Russian propaganda on social media isn't a pretty big problem with a certain group of people who are definitely overly online, and especially those who already believe certain conspiracy theories, because then it's easier to kind of inject some of that flavor into your propaganda and get them to believe it because they already believe one of the things that you're saying. And unfortunately, this seems to be more and more apparent now when you look at what people really believe about the Russia-Ukraine crisis on the ground at places like the People's Convoy, which has been a right-wing copycat movement of the Freedom Convoy, which I discussed in an earlier video. I mean, maybe we just need this kind of bad guy to justify ballooning our military budgets, and we've certainly done that here. And this is in addition to doubling our aid to give Ukraine in a single year more than we gave the Mujahideen in the entirety of Afghanistan. Again, not saying that was a great decision when we did it then, just pointing out that we're giving like a decade's worth of military aid all at once. And that even though we're doing this, and even though we have committed from the beginning not to put boots on the ground or actually use our military, for some reason our military budget is also ballooning at the same time. So the idea of taking the former Soviet states into the fold and reducing the us versus them mentality that's been used as the core of our cultural differences for the last 70 years and used during that time to again and again militarize against an overseas threat. It just never seems to have occurred to the people in power that this was a feasible option. After many years of sanctions that pushed their economy to the breaking point, we do kind of owe them in a very similar way that we owe Afghanistan, though perhaps not quite as literally. There's a point in the 1990s where NATO could have been phased out, or at least the military aspect of NATO, as it was no longer necessary, in that the Cold War was over. The only reason to maintain the NATO military alliances is if you want to maintain the Cold War. And I can see some argument for that. As you know, Soviet Russia may not be a part of the Soviet Union anymore. They may have economically collapsed, sure. But Russia, at the same time, didn't sell its nukes and didn't get rid of them either. The logic here being that it's still a nuclear powerhouse. Therefore, we should keep NATO as a safeguard against their nuclear power so long as they remain one. But I think that's just a perspective that makes enemies. There are other nuclear-armed countries out there that we don't have a NATO alliance against to keep them in check, right? So why is it that Russia is the one country that we still, to this day, do not trust with nuclear weapons? And there was a point when Russia asked to join NATO. We could have accepted them, along with all the other former Soviet states. It's a lot harder to declare war on someone when you're under some of the same military and economic frameworks, because the risk of tearing those frameworks apart could be damaging enough to encourage you not to declare war on one of your fellow members. And could Russia object to the former Soviet states, such as Ukraine, Georgia, Finland, all of these states? Could Russia really object to them joining NATO? Would they have the same argument about NATO getting right up against their borders if they were a NATO country themselves? Wouldn't that diffuse these rhetorical bombs? Before this, I said that the Russian state justification is paper thin, and the NATO argument is a bit of it, so let me debunk that. NATO has an open policy that they will not allow a state to join NATO if they do not control the entirety of the lands within their borders. So, from the beginning of this, separatists, Russian-backed separatists, the invasion of Donbass, even the invasion of Crimea, which remains contested internationally, Ukraine has not been eligible to join NATO. Whether or not they wanted to join, whether or not other countries might have wanted them in, or whether or not someone was willing to send them an invitation, ultimately the results will always be the same. It just wasn't going to happen unless Putin and the separatists were both willing to relent, and maybe even have to give back Crimea. This, like the myriad of excuses Putin made for himself, is a falsehood, really only designed to make sense to people who exclusively follow Russian state propaganda. Nazis run Ukraine? No. NATO will let Ukraine join? No. The people have voted for independence. Nope, not even that. The only true part is this. Ukraine was given its independence from today's Russia all the way back in the 19-teens. So unless Putin has a time machine, there's not much he can do about that one either. And as for his prospects of taking them back by force, I'm not convinced. During the Cold War, there was a concept known as the Doomsday Clock. The Doomsday Clock is a symbol that represents the likelihood of a man-made global catastrophe. Maintained since 1947 by the members of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the clock is a metaphor for threats to humanity from unchecked scientific and technical advances. The clock represents the hypothetical global catastrophe as midnight, and the Bulletin's opinion on how close the world is to a global catastrophe as a number of minutes or seconds to midnight, assessed in January of each year. The main factors influencing the clock are nuclear risk and climate change. The Bulletin Science and Security Board monitors new developments in the life sciences and technology that could inflict irrevocable harm to humanity. Midnight has a deeper meaning to it besides the constant threat of war. There are various things that are taken into consideration when scientists from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists decide what midnight and global catastrophe really mean in a particular year. They might include politics, energy, weapons, diplomacy, and climate science as potential sources of threats, including nuclear threats, climate change, bioterrorism, and even artificial intelligence. The clock's original setting in 1947 was 7 minutes to midnight. It has been set backward and forward 24 times since, the farthest being 17 minutes from midnight in 1991, and the nearest being 100 seconds. That's 1 minute and 40 seconds from midnight, and that has been from 2020 to the present. The clock was moved 2.5 minutes in 2017, then forward to 2 minutes to midnight, January of 2018, left unchanged in 2019. Then, in January of 2020, it was moved forward to 100 seconds before midnight. The clock setting has been left unchanged both in 2021 and 2022. Since 2010, the clock has been moved forward over 4 minutes, and has changed by 5 minutes and 20 seconds, even looking at its original setting in 1947. Due to multiple factors other than just nuclear annihilation, it's thought to represent in the public consciousness. This steady advance towards midnight could easily have as much or more to do with it the threat of global climate change than nuclear war. But it's interesting to note that in 1991, the year the final Soviet state, Ukraine, declared its independence, that's as close to safety as the world has ever been. Perhaps they too saw the means through which we might come to the end of an age of nuclear fears in that moment. And perhaps we have betrayed their hopes for the future in that moment as well, by maintaining a cold hostility towards Russia and a bitter indifference to the former Soviet states. I suppose only time will tell if we can ever make it back to 17 minutes to midnight again. Here's hoping.